The 20s were the beginning of mass tourism. The most important means of transportation was the railroad. And the prerequisite for this new leisure activity, paid vacation for workers and employees. Steam locomotives like the Adler have been traveling through German lands since 1835. The first route ran from Nuremberg to Fürth.
The real railroad age in Germany began on December 7, 1835, when a steam engine-powered train first made the long distance of 6 kilometers from Nuremberg to Fürth, taking a good quarter of an hour. That was the starting gun for the railroad age in Germany.
It was this invention from England that made the new means of transport possible, a development that was to make the German nation mobile.
Obviously, the railroad made it possible to get from one place to another much faster than before, and very comfortably and relatively cheaply. And this was, of course, for travellers of all kinds, and we're not just talking about tourists either. This new mode of transportation was extremely appealing to everyone.
In Great Britain, as early as 1825, the development of regular passenger rail transport had begun. In the summer of 1841, the resourceful Briton Thomas Cook organized a rail trip from Leicester to Loughborough. The fare included tea, ham sandwiches and a live band.
These excursions or day trips had been done by other people before. It was just that Thomas Cook's excursion in 1841 became famous because, as a strict teetotaler, he wanted to ban alcohol. There was a whole movement around this in England and later in other countries. And so he created this non-alcoholic folk festival on the train from Leicester to Loughborough, which isn't far, 13 miles, I think, and then back again. And that is mistakenly considered the first package tour.
The expansion of the route network enabled the railroad to penetrate even remote regions. As a result, it quickly developed into a means of mass transportation.
The first part of the route expansion in Germany ran until the 1870s and 80s with the building of the main routes, connecting the major centres, the capital cities, the business locations, the important trade hubs. And from the 1880s, the development of secondary lines began, which branched out from larger stations into the region and into the countryside. And through that, the whole country slowly became connected.
At the same time, the railroad became an economic growth engine, allowing a strengthening of a middle class which could now invest its financial resources in travel without an obvious purpose, in other words, tourism.
The railroad was actually the perfect means of transport, the perfect technology to offer package tours with. It made travelling easier and safer, of course, and also from an organisational point of view, whether I travelled somewhere with a horse or by train carriage. With a system like the railroad, one had a completely different level of risk. It had functioned very reliably from the very beginning, and also worked according to a timetable, meaning one could plan those travel times pretty accurately.
In the 19th century, the Rhineland developed into one of the first popular travel destinations in the German Empire. At that time, Karl Baedeker ran a publishing bookshop in Koblenz. His guidebook Rheinreise von Mainz nach Köln became a publishing success story.
Hat seinen Verlag in Koblenz gegründet, und zwar im selben Jahr.
He founded his publishing house in Koblenz in the same year that the Prussian Rhine Steamship Company was founded. So there was traffic on the Rhine, and there were relatively many tourists on the way. He would have noted that, and he would also have noted that there were quite a lot of Englishmen around from 1835-36, and many of them had one of those famous red books by John Murray with them, an English travel guide. He probably looked at those books very closely and then later adopted the red covers for which the Baedeker is so famous today.
The Baedeker travel guide became the standard and allowed travelers more independence and security. The costs and risks of a trip became calculable.
Die aufkommenden Reiseführer
The emerging travel guides channeled a lot of travelers. So if there was a Baedeker that showed a very specific region, then it actually happened that the tourists also checked off exactly that region. That is, walked through exactly the places that were in the Baedeker.
die im Baedeker eben standen.
From 1840 to 1910, the length of railroad lines in the German Reich grew from 500 to 63,000 kilometers, and passenger numbers exploded.
Diese Eisenbahn ermöglicht nun immer mehr Menschen sehr
The railroad now enabled more and more people to get somewhere very cheaply. And at that moment, what you might call mass tourism started to emerge. However, this was still limited to a small elite within the empire.
Schicht innerhalb des Kaiserreichs beschränkt.
I calculated that it was about 10% up until World War I, so around 1914, who travelled annually. And this practice of travelling every year, the vacation trip, that indeed changed people's lives very much.
Das Leben der Menschen sehr stark verändert.
The beaches on the North Sea and Baltic Sea also became popular holiday destinations for the middle classes during the Wilhelmine Empire. 700,000 people holidayed in those seaside resorts before the First World War. Many white-collar workers and almost all civil servants were entitled to annual leave at that time, still leaving 90% of workers who were not.
Die Rundreise
The round trip remained at that time still rather reserved for the men. But the stationary trip, the trip to the summer resort, was not as expensive as a spa. That was a matter for the bourgeois family. The bourgeois family, in fact, was actually created because of the holiday.
Urlaub erschaffen worden.
With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the idea of a pan-Europe of transport, as well as holidaying at home as a patriotic duty, came to an end. Mobilization posed great challenges for the railroads and became a race against time.
At the end of the First World War, these railroads were relatively at rock bottom. The states weren't allowed to sell them either. Also, they were considered part of the reparation pledge by the Allies as stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles.
As a result of the lost war, Emperor Wilhelm II had to abdicate. On the 10th of November 1918, he boarded his train at the Dutch border station of Echten and went into exile.
Es ging einfach diese großbürgerliche
This epoch of bourgeois security simply came to an end.
zu Ende. Man hat im Ersten Weltkrieg
During the First World War, people realized that many of the things they thought were safe were not.
eben nicht sicher ist.
And after World War I, people everywhere probably had very different concerns than they do now, such as visiting the Eiffel Tower.
Noch mal in Europa sich den Eiffelturm anzugucken.
In the Weimar Republic, white-collar workers, civil servants and blue-collar workers replaced the middle classes as the largest group of travelers, with tourism developing into an important factor in the national economy. Lower working hours and paid vacations, covered by collective agreements, were the prerequisites for this new form of leisure activity.
The great leap, the great development with regard to mass tourism happened in the 1920s because for the first time the possibility was created by the legislature and through the collective agreements that came about in the 1920s that there was a guaranteed holiday for a larger number of people. Before that, civil servants generally had a certain holiday entitlement, and now this holiday entitlement was extended to white-collar workers, and in some cases also to blue-collar workers. And that meant that the mass of the population had been reached as far as holiday entitlement was concerned. And of course, they also wanted to go away. They already went out into the countryside on Sundays, and if you had a few days' holiday, you wanted to go further. People had reduced working hours. That was also related to the collective bargaining agreement. The 8-hour day moved in, and that created a whole new way of organizing one's time.
Möglichkeit, seine Zeit zu gestalten.
The importance of modern transport advertising was recognized early on by Reichsbahner. Adolf Sarter published a guide. Advertising posters printed in English were intended to improve the German image abroad at the end of the 1920s.
The development of really seeing the traveller as a customer, of discovering the tourist as a factor for making money, took place in the period after the First World War with the German state railways, the Reichsbahn. This was the beginning of the time when intensive advertising was carried out, offering special social trains and special trains in general, on which to travel either independently, part independently, or in conjunction with travel agencies. And that's when you started to notice that the tourist as such had arrived at the railroad.
Jetzt ist der Tourist auch bei der Bahn als solcher angekommen.
Zwischen diesen Städten Nürnberg, Bamberg und Bayreuth liegt die Fränkische Schweiz. Sie ist eines der schönsten und zugleich romantischsten Landschaftsgebiete Süddeutschlands und von allen Seiten her mit der Bahn bequem zu erreichen.
One was informed, so to speak, and thereby encouraged to choose this destination. The special thing was that the railroad itself appeared only very little, often only a few minutes. The film about Franconian Switzerland, with a running time of a good hour, shows 3 to 4 minutes of railroad scenes, nothing more, because there was no alternative to the railroad at all. If you wanted to go there, you usually went by train.
Die Fränkische Schweiz ist ein Gebirgsländchen im Kleinen, das seinesgleichen sucht. Weite Höhenzüge, klappernde Mühlen, schattige Wälder.
The state railway played a major role in shaping the growing travel market with its range of services. Passenger travel took on greater importance as a source of income. At the end of the 1920s, lavishly produced advertising films such as Miss Evelyn, Die Badefee, Miss Evelyn, the Bathing Fairy, were intended to arouse the Germans' desire to travel. The film focused on the Bavarian state spa Bad Reichenhall and its tourist attractions.
One example was Miss Evelyn, the Bath Fairy, a young millionaire's daughter from the US who travels to Bad Reichenhall to recuperate. And all the war and inflation-damaged ex-aristocrats or young men are hot on her trail and want to conquer her. The whole film is set in Bad Reichenhall and showed in this way all the attractions of this modern health resort. The purpose was to lure people there, to show them this beautiful place so that they'd travel there. Evelyn, the Bathing Fairy, was the first advertising film to be made as a feature film, 70 minutes, and it ran in cinemas throughout the Reich.
The fact that the population was growing steadily in big cities like Berlin meant new transport concepts were needed.
For the first time in 20 years, the railroads were exposed to noticeable competition. That was the truck, especially in freight transport. But the automobile also appeared, both individual and in the form of buses.
In the 1920s, traffic density also increased in the major cities. Due to the expansion of public passenger and bus transport, the revenues of the state railroad declined. The private motor vehicle industry threatened the railroad's monopoly on transportation.
The National Railway had to react. It had to get to the customer. It had to learn to assert itself. Before, as a clear monopolist, this was not necessary at all. And so the Reichsbahn began to take a closer look at certain segments of the market, to advertise and serve them, or to use these new means of transportation itself. It had built up its own fleet of vehicles, for example, with a view to the tourist, the excursionist, the traveller, and had also created its own bus network.
Regular bus services developed, primarily under the leadership of the National Postal Service. The entire German route network had increased to 56,000 kilometers by the end of the 20s. In response, the National Railway expanded its range of special fares and shortened the journey time on certain routes, the aim being to attract more passengers again.